welcome to another episode of Classroom. So much talk this year about what happens with interest rates, where they go and how the economy, not just ours but globally, economies respond to that kind of interest rate move. But what does it all boil down to, and is there a direction or a trajectory that you can watch for over the next few months? My guest today, Jahangir Aziz of JP Morgan and Sonal Verma of Nomura. Great to have both of you on the show. Jahangir, just to understand this cycle, I guess we need to take a step back and understand where interest rates are coming from. So if you had to define interest rates, what would you say they are? Are they the broad parameters or tools that tweak an economy's growth?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way in which economists look at inflation rate, it's basically the price somebody needs to be paid for lending you money. So when things are looking very bright, so the future is looking very bright, that person will be charging you a higher rate of interest. And if things are looking pretty bad in the future, then the person is willing to charge you a much lower cost for the funds. So in a sense, interest rates essentially the price is a reflection of the price of future consumption or future welfare. And that's the way sort of economists look at it.
Sonal, how would you go about defining an interest rate cycle, and what kind of direction do you think it takes?
Interest rates, by definition, is the money that a bank charges. For instance, if I am a borrower and if I borrow 100 rupees from a bank, then if a bank charges me 7 rupees per annum for the money that it is lending to me, then 7% becomes the interest rates. Now, interest rate can be both from a lender's perspective, rather from a borrower's perspective, as well as from a saver's perspective. If I borrow money from a bank and I have to pay 7% per annum, then that is the prime lending rate. That's now the base rate or the lending rate that the bank charges. On the other hand, as a depositor, if I put 100 rupees with a bank and I get 5 rupees in return, that is the deposit rate that I'm getting. Ultimately, it's the money that bank charges on the money, whether it borrows from an individual or lends to a corporate. Interest rates can move up or can move down. The interest rate cycle really depends on a number of macroeconomic factors, but particularly two key determinants, which is growth and inflation.
So how would you then go about defining what an interest rate cycle is, Jahangir?
So as I said, I mean, the interest rate depends what the participants in that market think is going to happen to future growth, future activity, etc. So if you look at the way in which the activity itself has a cycle, so you go through the usual business cycles of a recession, and then you have a recovery, then it sort of reaches a peak, and then you have the slowdown, and finally you have the sort of back to the recession. So the interest rate cycle more or less also follows the same pattern, except for one thing, that the interest rate is supposedly lead that cycle. So the peak in the interest rate should come before the peak takes place in the business cycle activity. The bottom of the interest rate should come before the economy itself bottoms out.
Is that the way you would break up the move of the cycle as well then, Jahangir, depending on how the economy is moving, basically from periods of boom and bust or expansion and contraction?
Exactly. So right now, for example, let's take the global economy. It's a much easier thing to use as an example rather than India. If you look at the global economy, growth rate, let's take a specific interest rate, the 10-year U.S. Treasury. The 10-year U.S. Treasury was around 4% for quite some time till, let's say, April, May. And at that time, if you looked at any of the forecasts of economists or even all the expectations of the market, the expectation was that the U.S. economy and the global economy would grow above trend. Now, all of this was happening before Greece happened. And then Greece happens. And after Greece, there is a rethinking, both among economists as well as among analysts, that maybe growth isn't going to be that strong going forward. Greece could be a drag, and with that, Europe could be dragged down. As a result, what you notice is that the 10-year US Treasury rate sort of falls from 4% down to about 3.1, 3.2% in the last 2 months. Now, there are a lot of people who in the market actually believe there's a double dip coming in the third and the fourth quarter of this year. if you look at the writings of those people, they will be saying that actually the U.S. Treasury is headed for 2%, and even the 3.1, 3.2% is in the bottom. So again, it's just a reflection of how people see the economy in 6 to 8 quarters ahead.
Sonal, what would you say interest rate cycles are most sensitive to? I mean, is it the business environment that they're looking at, or does it always boil down to the inflationary situation at that point and how interest rates need to respond to the inflation figures and the inflation impact?
Interest rates are actually sensitive to both. Mostly globally, central banks have an objective of maintaining a potential output growth along with, stable inflation trajectory. Therefore, interest rate setting in any economy is a function of both the business environment, or what I would call the real activity, or the way growth cycles are moving, as well as how inflation is moving. For instance, in an economy which is rising at a very fast pace, typically every economy has a potential to grow. For India, this potential GDP growth is usually estimated around 8.5%. So typically when we are in an environment where growth rate is below this potential number, there is a lot of spare capacity in the economy. And typically when you have a lot of spare capacity, then there aren't too many inflationary pressures because there is a lot of excess capacity. What tends to happen when an economic cycle moves up is that this excess capacity gets used up as, investment picks up, consumption picks up, which actually puts upward pressure on prices because then there are limited resources for every demand that is really coming up. Therefore, typically what we see is that in an environment of high growth, inflationary pressures also tend to pick up. Now, the policy response to this, if you are in a high growth, high inflation environment, clearly the interest rate cycle will be moving up. On the other hand, if you are in a low inflation, low growth environment, then clearly the policy rates have to, or rather the entire interest rate cycle has to move down. If you are in a high growth and a low inflation scenario, which is always, very good, it's a Goldilocks scenario, typically policy rates move to what is called a neutral level of policy rate, which is consistent with the growth and inflation environment. The fourth, quadrant is where we have low growth and high inflation, which is typically called a stagflation, and policy response in that quadrant actually tends to be much more complicated.
Okay, let's take a break on that note. When we come back, plenty more. The tools to watch when we're talking about this interest rate cycle and which direction it may be moving towards.